The dusty platform of Cedar Creek Station shimmered under the relentless Texas sun as Martha Whitmore clutched her worn carpetbag with trembling fingers. The locomotive's whistle still echoed across the prairie, a mournful sound that seemed to carry away the last remnants of her old life. At 23, she had already been branded a failure by her own family, a woman whose body refused to fulfill what society deemed her most sacred duty. "You're nothing but a burden now." Her father's words still rang in her ears, spoken just 3 days ago in their cramped Missouri farmhouse. "No man will keep a barren wife, and we can't afford to feed another mouth that serves no purpose." The arrangement had been swift and cold. A newspaper advertisement, a brief correspondence, and a train ticket west. Martha had been sold like livestock to a stranger named Jake Sullivan, a rancher in the heart of Texas who claimed he needed a wife to manage his household. The $20 her father received barely covered the family's debts, but it was enough to rid them of their shameful daughter. The station master, a weathered man with kind eyes, approached her hesitantly. "Miss Whitmore? You waiting for Jake Sullivan?" Martha nodded, unable to trust her voice. The prairie wind whipped at her faded blue dress, the only good one she owned, carefully mended at the sleeves where wear had begun to show. "He'll be along shortly. Jake's a good man, miss. Don't let his scars frighten you none." Scars? Martha's stomach tightened. What kind of man had her family sold her to? 20 minutes later, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. A lone rider emerged from the heat haze, sitting tall in his saddle despite an evident stiffness in his left shoulder. As he drew closer, Martha could see that the station master's warning had been necessary. A jagged scar ran from Jake Sullivan's left temple down to his jaw, and his left arm hung slightly askew, as if it didn't quite fit properly anymore. Jake dismounted with careful precision, favoring his right leg. He was taller than Martha had expected, with dark hair touched by premature gray at the temples and eyes the color of summer storms. Those eyes studied her with an intensity that made her want to hide. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was gravelly, like he didn't use it often. "I'm Jake Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan." Martha dipped her head respectfully, the way her mother had taught her, though her mother had also taught her that such courtesies were wasted on a woman like her. Jake's gaze lingered on her face for a moment, and Martha braced herself for disappointment or disgust. Instead, she saw something unexpected, a flicker of understanding, as if he recognized something familiar in her guarded expression. "That your only bag?" "Yes, sir." He nodded and gestured toward his horse, a sturdy chestnut mare. "We've got about an hour's ride to the ranch. You comfortable on horseback?" I've ridden before, but not much." The truth was her family had owned only one old plow horse, and Martha had rarely been allowed to ride him. Without a word, Jake untied a smaller horse from behind his mare, a gentle-looking paint mare with intelligent eyes. "This is Sage. She's calm as still water. She'll take care of you." As Jake helped her mount, his touch was careful and impersonal, but Martha noticed the way his damaged left hand struggled with the reins. Whatever had happened to him, it had left him as broken as she felt. They rode in silence for the first half hour, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. The landscape was unlike anything Martha had ever seen, endless stretches of prairie punctuated by mesquite trees and the distant purple silhouette of hills. The sky seemed impossibly vast, a dome of blue so intense it made her eyes water. "It's beautiful," she said finally, surprised by her own voice. Jake glanced at her, and for the first time, his expression softened slightly. "Most folks find it too empty. Too harsh." "I think." Martha paused, searching for the right words. "I think it's honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." Something flickered across Jake's face, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. That's one way to see it. As they crested a small rise, the Sullivan Ranch spread out before them. It was larger than Martha had expected, with a sturdy 2-story house built from local limestone, several outbuildings, and corrals that held about 30 head of cattle. A vegetable garden struggled against the dry earth near the house, and Martha could see where someone had tried to coax life from the stubborn Texas soil. "It's not much," Jake said, his voice carefully neutral. But it's honest work and it's mine. Martha studied the ranch with new eyes. She saw the careful repairs on the barn, the neat arrangement of tools, the way everything had been built to last. This wasn't the desperate hovel she had feared, but the home of a man who took pride in what he had carved from the wilderness. "Your letter said you needed help managing the household," Martha said as they approached the house. Jake dismounted and helped her down from Sage, his movements still careful and measured. "I did. I do. But I want you to understand something, Miss Whitmore. I know why you're here. I know what your family told you about me, and I know what they told me about you." Martha's cheeks burned with shame. Of course he knew. Her father would have been explicit about her failing, ensuring the buyer knew exactly what damaged goods he was purchasing. "But here's the thing," Jake continued, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers directly. "I didn't buy you because I needed breeding stock. I'm not looking for sons to carry on my name or daughters to marry off for advantage. I needed someone who understands what it means to be cast aside, someone who won't expect more than I can give." The honesty in his voice was brutal and somehow liberating. Martha found herself standing straighter, meeting his gaze without flinching for the first time since leaving Missouri. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment Martha thought he wouldn't answer. Then he raised his left hand, showing her the way the fingers didn't quite close properly. "Gettysburg. Took shrapnel in my shoulder and arm. Left leg caught some too. Was told I was lucky to keep the limb. The war's been over for 20 years, Martha observed. Some wounds don't heal clean." Jake's voice was matter-of-fact, but Martha heard the pain underneath. "Makes a man difficult to live with. Makes him understand that sometimes the things that break us are also the things that make us who we need to be." As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Martha felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about what she couldn't do, what she couldn't give. Instead, she was thinking about what she might be able to build in this harsh, honest place with this scarred, honest man. "Mr. Sullivan," she said as he led her toward the house, "I want you to know that I'll work hard. I'll earn my place here." Jake paused at the front door, his hand on the worn wooden handle. "Martha," he said, using her given name for the first time, "you don't have to earn anything. You just have to decide if you want to stay." As they crossed the threshold together, Martha realized that for the first time in her life, someone was offering her a choice rather than making one for her. The feeling was terrifying and wonderful all at once, like standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering you might actually have wings. Martha's first week at the Sullivan Ranch passed in a blur of discovery and adjustment. The house, she learned, had been built by Jake's father in the 1860s, with thick limestone walls that kept the interior cool even when the Texas sun turned the prairie into a furnace. Jake had maintained it well, but it bore the unmistakable signs of a bachelor's residence, functional but sparse, clean but lacking the small touches that made a house feel like a home. The previous housekeeper left 2 years ago, Jake explained on her third morning as they sat at the kitchen table sharing coffee and biscuits Martha had learned to make from scratch. "Mrs. Henderson. Good woman, but her daughter in San Antonio needed help with her children." Martha nodded, studying Jake's profile as he gazed out the window toward the eastern pasture. In the morning light, his scars seemed less prominent, and she had begun to notice other things about him. The way he unconsciously flexed his damaged left hand when he was thinking, the careful precision with which he moved to compensate for his injuries, the genuine kindness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. "What would you like me to focus on first?" she asked. Jake turned back to her, and Martha was struck again by how directly he met her gaze. Most men either looked through her or avoided looking at her altogether, as if her barrenness might be contagious. But Jake saw her, really saw her, and didn't seem to find her wanting. "Whatever feels right to you," he said. "This is your home now, Martha. Make it feel like one." The word, home, sent a warm flutter through her chest. She had never been given such freedom before, never been trusted to make decisions that mattered. In her father's house, she had been told exactly what to do and when to do it, always with the underlying message that her opinions held no weight because she served no real purpose. That afternoon, while Jake rode out to check the cattle in the south pasture, Martha began her transformation of the house. She started small, wildflowers from the meadow behind the barn arranged in a mason jar on the kitchen table, curtains washed and rehung to catch the light more pleasantly, books organized on the shelves in the parlor. Each change felt like a tiny act of rebellion against everyone who had told her she was worthless. It was while she was scrubbing the windows in the front room that she saw the riders approaching. 3 men on horseback, moving with the kind of purposeful urgency that made Martha's stomach clench with anxiety. She recognized the feeling immediately, the same dread that had filled her whenever her father's creditors came calling. Jake appeared from the barn at the same moment, his right hand instinctively moving to rest on the revolver at his hip. Martha noticed how his entire posture changed, becoming alert and protective in a way that made her realize this man had faced danger before and survived it. The lead rider was a heavy-set man with a carefully waxed mustache and clothes too fine for ranch work. His companions looked like hired guns, lean and dangerous, with eyes that missed nothing. "Sullivan," the well-dressed man called out as they reined in their horses near the front porch. "I'm Thomas Brennan. I represent certain interests in Austin who are very interested in your land." "My land's not for sale, Brennan." Jake's voice was level but carried an unmistakable warning. Brennan's smile was cold and calculating. "Everything's for sale, Sullivan. It's just a matter of price. And sometimes, it's a matter of understanding what might happen to a man's property if he's unreasonable about negotiations." Martha felt her blood run cold. She had heard that tone before, had seen that kind of smile on the faces of men who took what they wanted regardless of others' wishes. Without thinking, she stepped out onto the porch, positioning herself where both Jake and the visitors could see her. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the polite steel her mother had taught her to use with unwelcome callers. "I'm afraid you've caught us at an inconvenient time. Mr. Sullivan and I were just about to sit down to dinner." Brennan's eyes shifted to her, and Martha saw the calculation there, trying to determine what kind of woman would show herself during a business discussion, what that might mean about Jake's situation. "Ah, the new Mrs. Sullivan, I presume?" Brennan's tone was oily with false courtesy. "How lovely. I'm sure you want what's best for your husband's future." "I want what's best for our future," Martha corrected firmly. "And that includes not being threatened on our own property." One of Brennan's companions shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun belt, but Jake stepped forward smoothly, his own weapon now clearly visible. "I think you gentlemen have said what you came to say," Jake stated, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in battle. "I'll ask you to leave my property now." For a long moment, the two groups faced each other in tense silence. Then Brennan's smile widened, becoming even more unpleasant. "Of course, Sullivan. But you might want to think about our conversation. These are dangerous times for isolated ranchers. Cattle rustlers, Indian raids, all sorts of unfortunate accidents can befall a man who doesn't have the right kind of protection." With that thinly veiled threat, Brennan wheeled his horse around and led his companions back toward the main road. Martha remained on the porch until they disappeared from sight, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Martha!" Jake's voice was soft but urgent. "Come inside." In the kitchen, Jake moved to the window and watched the dust cloud raised by the departing riders. His jaw was tight, and Martha could see the tension in every line of his body. "Who was that man?" she asked. "Trouble," Jake replied grimly. "There's been talk in town about Eastern investors looking to buy up ranch land for railroad development. Some folks are selling willingly, but others—" He shook his head. "Others are finding it hard to say no when their cattle start disappearing or their barns catch fire." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What will you do?" Jake turned to face her, and Martha was surprised by the conflict she saw in his expression. "I should send you back," he said quietly. "This isn't what you signed up for. It's not safe." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Martha had intended. "Mr. Sullivan, Jake, I've never had a home before. Not really. And I've never had someone trust me to help build something worthwhile. I'm not leaving just because things might get difficult." Jake studied her face for a long moment, and Martha held her breath, afraid he might insist on sending her away for her own safety. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Then we'd better start preparing," he said. "If Brennan's involved, this is going to get worse before it gets better." That night, as Martha lay in her small bedroom listening to the sounds of the prairie settling into darkness, she realized something had fundamentally changed. For the first time in her life, she had stood up to dangerous men and refused to be intimidated. More importantly, she had done it not just for herself, but for someone she was beginning to care about. The woman who had arrived at Cedar Creek Station a week ago had been broken and ashamed, willing to accept whatever scraps of life were thrown her way. But the woman lying in this bed, in this house, on this land she was beginning to love, was discovering that she had strength she never knew existed. Outside her window, a coyote called to its pack across the moonlit prairie, and Martha smiled in the darkness. She was beginning to understand what Jake had meant about wounds that didn't heal clean. Sometimes the breaking was what made space for something stronger to grow. 2 weeks after Brennan's visit, Martha woke to the sound of Jake's voice in urgent conversation with someone in the yard. Dawn was just breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of pearl and rose, but the tone of the voices made her dress quickly and hurry to the kitchen window. Jake stood near the barn talking to Tom Henderson, a neighboring rancher whose property bordered theirs to the north. Even from a distance, Martha could see the anger and worry in Tom's posture, the way he gestured emphatically toward the horizon. She stepped onto the porch just as Tom was mounting his horse to leave. "Jake, you be careful now," Tom called out. "If they hit the Morrison place last night, yours could be next. Sarah's got the children packed and ready to head to town if need be." After Tom rode away, Jake stood for a long moment staring toward the northern pasture, his damaged left hand unconsciously flexing in the way that meant he was deeply troubled. "What's happened?" Martha asked, approaching him with 2 cups of coffee. Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, his eyes still scanning the horizon. "Rustlers hit the Morrison ranch sometime after midnight. Took about 20 head of cattle and burned their hay barn. Left a message carved into the fence post." "What did it say?" "Sell or lose everything." Jake's voice was grim. "Same thing happened to the Kellys last week, and the Pattersons before that. All folks who refused Brennan's offers." Martha felt the familiar chill of fear, but underneath it was something new, a fierce protectiveness for this place she was beginning to love, for this man who had given her a chance at a real life. "What can we do?" Jake looked at her sharply. "Martha, I meant what I said before. This isn't your fight. I can arrange for you to stay in town until—" "No." Martha set down her coffee cup with a decisive clink. "Jake Sullivan, you listen to me. I've spent my whole life being told I was useless, that I had nothing to contribute. I won't run away the first time someone needs me to be brave." Something flickered in Jake's storm-gray eyes, surprise, admiration, and something deeper that made Martha's heart skip. "It's dangerous, Martha. These aren't men who'll be deterred by politeness or reason. Then we'll have to be stronger than they are." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, but we do this smart. Tom's organizing the neighboring ranchers to watch out for each other. We'll take turns riding patrol, and we'll coordinate our efforts." The next few days passed in tense preparation. Jake taught Martha to load and fire his spare rifle, impressed by her steady hands and quick learning. He showed her the hiding places around the ranch where she could take cover if needed, and together they moved their most valuable possessions to a hidden compartment he had built beneath the kitchen floor during the uncertain years right after the war. "You were a soldier," Martha observed one evening as they cleaned the weapons together by lamplight. "I can tell by the way you think about defense." Jake's hands stilled on the rifle he was oiling. 3rd Texas Infantry. Fought from Bull Run to Appomattox. Lost more friends than I care to count. "Is that where you were wounded?" "Gettysburg." Jake's voice was distant, remembering. July 3, 1863. Pickett's charge. "Most fool thing I ever was part of, marching across open ground into Union artillery. Lost my sergeant, my best friend, and near lost my life. Woke up in a field hospital 3 days later with a Confederate surgeon telling me I might never use my left arm properly again. Martha reached across the table and gently touched his scarred hand. But you survived. Sometimes I wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. Jake's eyes met hers. Until recently. The intensity in his gaze made Martha's breath catch. In the golden lamplight, with his guard down and honesty in every line of his face, Jake Sullivan was the most handsome man she had ever seen. More than that, he was the first person who had ever looked at her as if she mattered. Jake, she began, not sure what she wanted to say, but he held up his good hand. Martha, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you before. Her heart began to race. Was he going to send her away after all? Had she misunderstood his growing kindness? When I wrote that letter answering your father's advertisement, I told him I needed a wife to manage my household. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Martha waited, afraid to breathe. The truth is, I've been alone for so long I forgot what it felt like to have someone to care about. When your father wrote about your situation, I saw something familiar. Someone else who'd been told they weren't good enough, weren't whole enough. I thought maybe we could be incomplete together and somehow make something complete. Martha's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. And now, she whispered. Jake's scarred fingers intertwined with hers across the table. Now I think maybe we're not as broken as we thought. Maybe we're just different. Maybe different is what makes us strong. Before Martha could respond, the sound of hoofbeats in the yard made them both freeze. Jake blew out the lamp instantly, plunging the kitchen into darkness, and motioned for Martha to stay low as he moved to the window. For riders, he whispered. Coming up fast. Martha's heart hammered as she crept to the back door, rifle in hand, just as they had practiced. Through the window, she could see the riders circling the house, clearly looking for the best approach. Then Tom Henderson's voice called out from the darkness, Jake! It's Tom! We've got trouble! Jake opened the front door cautiously, keeping his weapon ready until he was sure. Tom and 3 other neighbors rode into the yard, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim in the moonlight. They hit the Kelly place tonight, Tom said without preamble. Burned the house, ran off all the stock. Jim Kelly's in town with Doc Harrison. Took a bullet in the shoulder trying to fight them off. Mary Kelly says there were at least 8 of them, and they're heading this way. Martha felt the blood drain from her face, but her hands remained steady on her rifle. Around the yard, she could see the other ranchers checking their weapons, their faces set with the determination of men protecting their homes and families. How long do we have? Jake asked. Maybe an hour, maybe less. They're being methodical about it, hitting every ranch that refused Brennan's offer. Jake nodded grimly. Then we'd better be ready for them. As the men began discussing defensive positions and tactics, Martha realized that the comfortable life she had begun to build was about to be tested by fire. But looking at Jake's determined face, feeling the solid weight of the rifle in her hands, she discovered that she was ready for the test. She had found her home, her family, her purpose. And she would fight for all of it. The attack came just before dawn, when the sky was that peculiar gray color that made it hard to distinguish shapes from shadows. Martha crouched behind the stone wall of the well, her rifle trained on the southern approach to the house, just as Jake had positioned her. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her hands were steady. From her vantage point, she could see Jake behind the overturned wagon near the barn, and Tom Henderson positioned at the corner of the house. The other neighbors had spread out in a defensive perimeter that Jake had designed based on his military experience, overlapping fields of fire that would make it costly for anyone to approach the ranch buildings. The first sign of trouble was the absence of sound. The usual dawn chorus of birds had gone silent, and even the cattle in the near pasture had stopped their morning lowing. It was the kind of unnatural quiet that made the hair on the back of Martha's neck stand up. Then she saw them, dark shapes moving through the mesquite and tall grass, using the pre-dawn gloom as cover. 8 men, just as Mary Kelly had said, spreading out to surround the ranch. Martha caught Jake's eye and held up 8 fingers, and he nodded grimly. The attack began with a shout from their leader, a tall man Martha didn't recognize. Sullivan, you've got one chance to walk away from this. Come out with your hands up and we'll let you and your woman ride out. Like hell, Jake called back, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "This is my land, and I'm not going anywhere." The response was immediate, muzzle flashes erupting from multiple positions as the attackers opened fire. Martha ducked as bullets chipped stone from the well wall near her head, then rose to return fire at a man she could see moving between the outbuildings. The battle was fierce but brief. Jake's military training and the defensive positions he had chosen gave the defenders a crucial advantage, while the attackers had clearly expected to face only a crippled veteran and a lone woman. Instead, they found themselves caught in a crossfire from experienced fighters who knew the terrain intimately. When the shooting stopped, 3 of the attackers lay motionless in the yard, while the others had fled back toward the main road. Tom Henderson had taken a graze across his forehead, and one of the other ranchers had a bullet burn on his arm, but none of the defenders had been seriously hurt. "They'll be back," Jake said grimly as they gathered in the yard to assess the situation. "And next time they'll bring more men." But Tom Henderson was shaking his head, a grin spreading across his weathered face despite the blood trickling from his forehead. "No, I don't think they will. Look there." He pointed toward the main road, where a cloud of dust was approaching rapidly. As it drew closer, Martha could make out the forms of at least 20 riders, but these were coming from the direction of town, not from whatever hole Brennan's men had crawled out of. The lead rider was Sheriff Morrison, Jim Kelly's brother, and behind him rode what looked like half the men in Cedar Creek. Word of the night's attacks had spread quickly, and the town had finally had enough of Brennan's intimidation tactics. "Jake Sullivan," Sheriff Morrison called out as he reined in his horse. "You folks all right?" "We're fine, Sheriff," Jake replied, but his eyes were on the crowd of townspeople behind Morrison. "What brings you out here?" "Justice," Morrison said simply. "Found Brennan and his remaining men holed up in the old Peterson barn. They won't be troubling anyone again." Martha felt her knees go weak with relief. It was over. The threat that had hung over them like a storm cloud was finally gone. As the sun climbed higher and the crowd of supporters began to disperse, Jake and Martha found themselves alone in their yard for the first time since the trouble had started. The familiar sounds of morning had returned: birds singing, cattle lowing, the whisper of wind through the grass. "Martha," Jake said, his voice unusually quiet, "what you did this morning, the way you stood your ground, I want you to know that I've never been prouder to stand beside anyone." Martha looked at this man who had given her a home, a purpose, a chance to discover her own strength, and felt her heart overflow with emotions she had never expected to feel. "Jake, I need to tell you something. When I first came here, I thought I was just trading one form of servitude for another. I thought you had bought me to be your housekeeper and nothing more." Jake's expression grew concerned. "Martha, I never meant for you to feel." "Let me finish," she said gently. "What I discovered is that you didn't buy me at all. You gave me a choice, and then you gave me time to figure out who I really am. You gave me a family." She gestured toward the neighbors who were still helping clean up the aftermath of the fight, toward the town that had ridden out to defend them, toward the land that had become as precious to her as breathing. "This," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of this. I never knew family could be something you choose, something you build together instead of something you're just born into." Jake stepped closer, his storm-gray eyes intense. "Martha, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I choose this life, Jake Sullivan. I choose this land, this home, and I choose you. Not because I have to, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I want to be. This is where I belong." Jake's scarred face transformed with a smile that made him look years younger. "And I choose you, Martha. Not because you can give me children or because you can cook and clean, but because you're the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. Because when I'm with you, I don't feel broken anymore." When he kissed her, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Around them, the Texas prairie stretched endlessly under the morning sun, harsh and beautiful and honest, just like the love they were building together. 6 months later, as Martha worked in the garden she had expanded behind the house, she paused to watch Jake working with a new foal in the corral. His movements were still careful, still compensating for his old injuries, but there was a lightness in his bearing that hadn't been there when she first arrived. "Mrs. Sullivan?" The voice belonged to young Billy Henderson, Tom's 12-year-old son, who had taken to stopping by the ranch regularly since the troubles ended. "Yes, Billy? Pa says to tell you that the school board meeting is next week, and they're still hoping you'll consider being the new teacher. They sure could use someone with your education." Martha smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. The idea of teaching had never occurred to her before coming to Texas, but several of the town families had approached her after learning about her schooling back in Missouri. The thought of helping children learn, of contributing to the community in a meaningful way, filled her with excitement. "Tell your father I'll be there," she said. As Billy rode away, Jake approached from the corral, leading the foal he had been working with. "Good news?" he asked, noting her expression. "The best kind," Martha replied, slipping her arm through his. "The kind that means we get to keep building this life together." That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over their land, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had been sold as damaged goods, cast aside by people who saw her only as a failure. But in this harsh, honest place, with this good, damaged man beside her, she had discovered that family wasn't about blood or biology. Family was about choosing to stand together when trouble came. It was about seeing the best in each other even when the rest of the world saw only flaws. It was about building something beautiful and lasting from the broken pieces of who you used to be. Jake's scarred hand found hers in the gathering twilight, and Martha squeezed gently, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. Two people who had been told they weren't whole, discovering that together they were everything they needed to be. The Texas wind whispered through the grass around their home, carrying the promise of all the tomorrows they would face together, and Martha Sullivan smiled, knowing she was exactly where she belonged.